Hi, David. We're delighted to have you with us today at the 12th edition of the World Pensions Forum and 5th G7 Pensions Dialogue. I know that, because of the logistical airline and travel chaos we are witnessing now in Europe, that you couldn't risk it and come to Paris for just 1 or 2 days as planned. So we're pre-recording that session, literally, I think, 7 hours before the start of the conference. And I'm delighted to have with us today for that interview of David Weber, my colleague who just arrived from London in the nick of time, Chris Smith, who's with us today on the screen. And bonjour.
Hello, everyone. Hello, David. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Chris. Nick, first of all, just thank you as always for the invitation. I'm so sorry not to be with you in person. Really hope to be able to do that next time, and always love these conferences. And Chris, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, David, and look forward to seeing you in the real flesh soon.
Me too. Me too.
And without further ado, we're jumping into the flesh of that talk with you, and we wanted you to give us, a high-level David Weber. And for those who haven't read your book, you're of course a professor at Boston University School of Law or Law School, and you're one of the pioneers of the notion of employee capitalism or workers' capitalism. And I think the title of your book was cautiously optimistic, because you were saying with a question mark, is it the last hope, or is it whatever, the last ray of hope? So hopefully it is. Hopefully it is the last ray of hope. But
last best weapon. It was a little more military,
more
perhaps,
martial,
unfortunately.
I'm a pacifist, but you had a more martial title, more Roman title. So basically, considering all that, I want you to hit us with your high-level Nixonian, power talk. So basically, what are the recent trends you're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic, focusing on that notion of fiduciary capitalism, workers' capitalism, employee capitalism, as you guys, Chris, call it in Britain. So we've heard a lot recently, very recently, on the revival of workers' ownership, and I think there was a big KKR project to that end in the US. Tell us more about it.
Sure. Well, that is one interesting development that I think folks are keeping an eye on, which is the spread of this idea of worker ownership. That is, that workers should own a stake in the companies where they work. And KKR, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, has gotten a lot of attention for this recently because of a very high profile recent deal that they did, in which a number of employees of a company that was based in Ohio, I believe, that made garage doors and tools of that sort, had significant worker participation, significant worker ownership. And when the company was sold, many workers saw, quite handsome returns. The kinds of numbers you don't ordinarily see workers in that space in manufacturing and so forth getting. And so it got a lot of attention. I spoke to the Financial Times about it. And it's very interesting to see this move by private equity. Pete Stavros at KKR is affiliated with it, but we're seeing it in many different places. And, on the one hand, there's some cause, I think, for skepticism here. I think that private equity is finally coming to grips with the fact that it has, to an extent, I think, quite deservedly, developed a very bad reputation with workers, a reputation for taking over companies and either firing lots of workers or really squeezing down on wages and benefits.
The barbarians at the gate, right?
Exactly right. Exactly that reputation, deserved reputation. And I think it's finally starting to hurt them. And private equity gets somewhere between a third and a half of its assets under management from worker pension funds, public pension funds, labor funds. And so I think that they've started to realize that they need to turn this around if they, A, for public reputation questions, B, for ongoing business reputation questions. And so we've seen this worker ownership development. We're continuing to see spread of responsible contractor policies by worker pension funds, which basically just means that, say, when New York City makes an investment in infrastructure or real estate, they're going to require fair wages and benefits being paid to workers union projects and so forth. So in the private equity space, yes, we continue to see a combination of worker ownership, union investment requiring union labor on the projects. And I think it's one to watch closely in the coming years.
Great. I mean, that's great. And it's fascinating because it's counterintuitive because, of course, we had all these preconceived, like you wrote in your great book, to a large, partly justified, partly to be diplomatic, partly justified in some instances of some of these private capital markets, Wall Street wolves, sometimes, stripping out the assets of the companies and mistreating workers. Of course, it is changing rapidly, and I'm glad because, that sort of progressive vocabulary of, worker or Gaullist or social democratic vocabulary of, workers' participation. It would have been difficult to imagine, these Wall Street titans use it in their daily lives 6-7 years ago. So perhaps it's a sign, the lexicon or the words themselves are a signs, hopefully, that things are changing. So we're very hopeful. Now on to a next, I know that you need to dash in 10 minutes, but on to the next issue I wanted to pick your brains about. I know that your former neighbor, the mayor of Boston, has joined the Biden cabinet, and he's really one of the strong voices, progressive voices, ESG voices in the Biden White House. And I think the Department of Labor at federal level is also coming up with new guidelines.
That's right. So Marty Walsh, former Boston mayor, and interestingly, he's not only Secretary of Labor in the Biden administration, he's the first union member, actual union member, to hold that position in decades. Actually, kind of shocking that there hasn't been a union member as Secretary of Labor in many decades. So
even in the Clinton era and the Obama
correct.
era.
That's right. That's exactly right. So Walsh indeed almost immediately revoked recent regulations and guidances propounded by the Trump/Scalia U.S. Department of Labor, which would really have sharply narrowed fiduciary duty, very much cracked down on the possibility of, for example, taking workers or the environment into consideration. And in fact, even went far enough to effectively suspend the possibility for pension funds to even vote their proxies. I mean, really shocking and extreme regulatory reforms that came out of the Trump-Scalia Department of Labor in the waning days of that administration. But almost immediately, within a week or two of the Biden administration taking office, it suspended those rules and proposed new regulations. Now, these regulations, unsurprisingly, are far better than not only what Trump did. I frankly think they are better and more accommodating of ESG and of considerations like workers than almost any guidance or rulemaking that has come out of the Department of Labor ever. That having been said, I can't help but still nitpick. I wish that they had gone even further. And they're not. We'll see what the final rule looks like. We don't have it. Certainly, they made it clear that ESG is an appropriate consideration by trustees in making investments. They also made it clear that taking into account working conditions, for example, workers, is also an appropriate consideration for trustees. I think one of the things that concerns me is worker pension funds being invested in ways that undermine worker jobs. And when you do that, you actually cut off worker contributions. It's very important to remember pension funds are financed from 3 sources, not one. They're not just about returns. They're also funded from contributions by the employer and by the employee. And when you are using worker pension funds to kill off worker jobs, which is happening, say, with privatization on the state side, you not just cut off or worry about returns, you're also stopping contributions by workers and employees and really narrow definitions of fiduciary duty that say you have to only focus on returns have the potential to actually cut out 2 of the other 3 legs of the stool. So we'll see. We're still watching for that Biden DOL, Biden Walsh Department of Labor rulemaking to drop.
Yeah, and I know, so this is really at federal level, Marty Walsh doing great work, at federal level. I know that you're also involved in America because, here in Europe or in France, we're very centralized, but in the US, at state and municipal level, a lot of the laws and regulations are actually more at state level, and all of the pension money is actually run very fiercely, independently at state level. And I know that you're doing a lot of work at state level in several key jurisdictions in the US today, but we're short on time and I know you're busy. So we'll leave that state level work you're doing for next time. And next time will be hopefully in December in Paris. And hopefully we can have the pleasure of hosting you again, as they say in England, in the flesh in December in Paris. But, for our last 3-4 minutes, I want to hand over the microphone to my colleague from the city of Westminster, who's not only a pension fund board member, but he has many hats. Another one being he's himself a labor trade union leader for Unison, the largest civil service syndicat or labor organization in Britain. And I think he wanted to pick your brains as to more recent developments in the making in Europe. Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, so David, tell us more about the recent work alongside great policy thinkers and union people you've been working with in the control of pensions.
Sure. Well, actually, I've recently been involved a bit with some pensions and pension lawyers in Germany. And that's a very exciting development from my perspective. In many ways, of course, Germany, when it comes to worker issues and worker rights, is far ahead of the United States, far ahead even of the rest of Europe in terms of, say, co-determination. It's widely understood that there's worker representation on corporate boards in Germany, comparatively strong union sector.
Even though a small caveat, everything you said is of course true, but small caveat or footnote, even though the combined assets of these German pension schemes are average or smallish in size, in AUM size.
Absolutely. Well, and in fact, you got to the point I was going to make, which is that surprisingly, sort of like occupational pensions in Germany are, say, far smaller than the Dutch pensions are. And obviously, the Netherlands is a much smaller country, but a much, much bigger pension base. And so Germany is thinking seriously about what to do about that and how to grapple with employers trying to grapple with the long-term liabilities they're carrying on their books. And they passed some legislation about 4 years ago to try to induce unions to step up and play a bigger role here, which I actually would like to see them do. Hasn't quite happened yet. It'll be interesting to see. But I think one of the things I've been trying to say to them is, look, if you create these worker pension funds that unions have say in, that you have union members and workers on the boards of these pension funds, yes, of course, we have to be thinking about the liability side, which is how much are we paying workers in retirement? How do we finance that? Where does the money come from? But I'm also trying to say, hey, look, if you take that step, along with that comes significant shareholder power, right? You have German workers in occupational pensions with worker voice on those boards invested in markets. That comes along with the right to vote your shares. That comes along with the right to sue, to go after the CEO's pay. In some instances, if need be, to divest, right? So increasingly, it just seems to me the case with global capital markets in the 21st century being as powerful as they are, operating globally while governments are still operating primarily locally, and so forth. Even unions and labor, often a local phenomenon. These worker pensions have the potential to advance worker interests inside the marketplace. And so I keep saying, look, unions have legislative strategies, they have electoral strategies, they need capital strategies, and they need voice inside markets. And that's one really positive way to look at this potential development in Germany.
That's great. So on that note, I like to say the word because it's a centrist word, but on the note of cautious optimism, and I think it's great, because in many ways, because of its political clout and the size of its GDP, and hopefully in the future, the size of its pension fund AUM, thanks to these initiatives with which you are associated, Germany is really a central, pivotal state or nation, and if things change there, it can have a very positive influence on the rest on other neighboring EU jurisdictions. And I think as you may have heard, a new French government was formed literally 8 hours ago. So history is in the making. So if we survive these huge transportation strikes and other the summer of discontent. But that summer of discontent perhaps is sending us a message that these overdue social changes are happening. And I like what you said earlier, because it's shocking when you think of it, that even in the Obama and Clinton eras, there were no trade union labor guy in a senior cabinet role in Washington, which is really hard to believe. And I think now perhaps the pendulum will be swinging. So it's a welcome development. Thank you for joining us 7 hours, I think, before the start of our conference. It was a pleasure to have you, and hopefully we can host you in the flesh in Paris in December.
Have a wonderful conference. I hope to join you in person again soon. And thanks as always for the invitation and for taking the time.
Merci David. Merci David. À bientôt. À bientôt.
Bientôt.
Bye, guys.